And I just love this block. It's an optical illusion block if you use the right colors. And it is a 12.5-inch block, which will finish in your quilt at 12 inches. And it's a 9 patch. So let's head over to the design wall and I'll show you how the 9 patches make up the block. The block consists of a center square, 4 half square triangles, and then 4 flying geese blocks, and then 4 rectangles. And right now I don't have these sewn together, but they would consist of 1 patch to make the 9 patch. To get the full effect of the optical illusion, I've chosen almost a white background, dark center and edges of my flying geese block, and then a medium color for my folded corner effect, and then a lighter color for my rectangles. There are lots of ways to make this flying geese block. Today I'll be showing you my favorite technique that gives me consistent good results. For the 4 half square triangle patches, you'll need to cut 2 5-inch squares of your medium fabric and 2 5-inch squares of your background fabric. For the center of the block, you'll cut 1 4.5-inch square of your dark fabric. From your light colored fabric, cut 4 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangles. To make 4 flying geese patches, you'll cut 1 7-inch square from your dark fabric and 1 5.5-inch square from your background fabric. I did want to mention a little tip when you're using these dark fabrics that look the same on the front and the back. There's actually a little bit of difference between the color from the front to the back. So when I'm cutting my fabric, I always mark with a little pin and indicate which side I designate as the front so it stays consistent through the block. To construct the half square triangles, I'll just do a little synopsis for you in this video. I did do the same exact size half square triangles using the same exact technique in my Jacob's Ladder quilt block, and I'll link to it here for you. Basically, what I've done is drawn a diagonal line on the wrong side of the light colored fabric, and I place the light colored fabric on the medium fabric right sides together, and I sewed a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of the line that I drew, and cut the patches apart on my drawn lines and press. And for this particular patch, I'll be pressing toward my background fabric, and that simply means have the background fabric on top, give it a finger press, and then press. Now this is pressing toward the light, which is just because of the colors that I chose for the particular block. Usually you want to press toward the dark in quilting so it kind of camouflages that seam allowance. And then square up the half square triangles to 4.5 inches square. And I'm using my Quilt in a Day square up ruler. I've simply placed the diagonal line on the ruler on my seam line. And then I will make sure I have a little bit of fabric on each of the 4 sides beyond the 4.5 inch marks. I'll then trim here and here. And then flip the block around. Line up along the diagonal edge once more. This time line up at exactly 4.5 inches on the left and on the bottom, making sure the diagonal line is exactly lined up, and trim. To construct the flying geese patches, take your 5.5 inch square of the background, flip it to the wrong side and draw your diagonal line from one corner to the other, and then place the background fabric on your dark fabric right sides together and center. And I like to use a ruler just to double check and make sure I have my fabric centered, and you're just looking for 3/4 inch of the darker fabric showing around the edge. And I'll just place a couple of pins to hold it in place. I'll take it to the machine and I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of my drawn line. And press, set the seam, and this time you'll be pressing toward the larger fabric. So I have the larger fabric on top. Just give it a little finger press. And I'll repeat that on the other patch. On the back of one of your patches, draw a diagonal line from here to here. Now place your patches right sides together, opposite colors. So we have the white here and the blue here and the white here. And this time we're not worrying about matching up any seams at this point. We're just going to match up the outside four corners. I'll take it to the machine, and again I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of my drawn line. I have my leader fabric that I'm using, and I did go ahead and place 1 pin on each side of my line just to keep the fabrics in place. And you do want to make sure as you get to the other seam that's on the back that just with your fingers make sure that it stays nice and flat. And right down the other side. Remove my pins. Once again, cut from one corner to the other. Now that they're cut apart, open, and you can see one goose is here and one goose is here. And on the back, what I'll be doing at the pressing area is I want to make sure when I press, I want to press this seam this direction, so see how the goose lies flat? And I want this one to be pressed in this direction, so this goose lies flat. So in order to do that, I'll just cut a little notch in this fabric right here, just right up to the seam allowance. I won't cut those stitches. So right here, I'll just cut a little notch, and it'll just help with the pressing. You can get that. And I'll take it over to the pressing area and do that right now. I'll set the seam. And then with this particular patch, I like to press from the back to begin with. So I'll just make sure it's nice and flat. And again, I'm wanting this goose to be flat in the back. So I'll just kind of tug on this, not a lot. I don't want to distort it. I just don't want any of the fabric getting caught up in the pressing. And then I'll repeat that over here. And there's where I clipped. Then I'll press from the front. Now if I fold it in half, you can see that it starts to look like a flying goose block. So I'll take it over to the cutting area and show you how to square it up. Place the patch so one of the geese is facing you with the long side right here. And then I'm just using an OmniGrid ruler. You can use any ruler, quilting ruler that has the angle lines on it. And you're looking for the 45-degree angle. And all you do is place the 45-degree line on the line of your goose. And the other place you're going to look is right here at the tip. And you want to place your 1/4 inch mark right at the tip. So that gives you a 1/4 inch seam allowance right there. And here's a little bit more of a close-up. So this line, and then here's my 1/4 inch mark right here. And there's the tip of my goose right there. So I'll be cutting right there. Now I'll repeat that, I'll set that one aside. I'll repeat that with my other half. Find my 45-degree line and my 1/4 inch line and cut. Now I'll switch to my Quilt in a Day square up ruler. I really like to use this one because it's very clear, easy to see, not very busy with too many lines. So we want the block after it's trimmed, the patch, to measure 2.5 by 4.5. So what I'll do is I'll trim this edge off here. We've already trimmed this one. So I'll line up my ruler along the top and I'll line up the point, which is the center of the patch, at my 2 1/4 inch line, which is half of 4.5. So I'll just line it up and trim off right here. Now I'll flip the patch in the opposite direction and I'll line up my 45-degree line this time right on my line of the goose, and I want to trim the block up right now to 4.5. Here's my 4.5 inch line and 2.5 inch line. So I'll do that as close as I can get it. And again, keeping in mind this line needs to stay right on that seam line. And I'll cut here and here. So now I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance right here, and I have it measured exactly 2.5 by 4.5, and I'll repeat that and continue trimming my other patch. I've arranged all my patches in the correct pattern. The first thing I'll do to assemble the block is attach my rectangles to my flying geese, and I'll just simply place them right sides together and then place a pin where I want to begin sewing and the direction that I want to sew. And at this point it's a rough pin. I'll line it up better over at the machine. I just want to indicate which direction I'll be sewing, and I'll do that with the other 3 as well. And I'll be sewing a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here. Okay, I'll pull my pin out, line up a little bit more accurately. And again, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'll clip these apart and I'll press toward my rectangle, set my stitches, give it a little finger press, and I'll continue that with the other 3 patches. And I always take a few minutes to square up each patch that I just assembled. This needs to measure 4.5 inches square, and I'll use this diagonal line as a reference right here, and then my 2 1/4 inch measurement mark right in the center. Make sure that's lined up, and then make sure it measures 4.5 inches square. I'll do that to each of my patches and do any trimming that's necessary. To continue assembling the block, I'll just do right sides together. Again, using a pin to indicate where I want to begin sewing and the direction I'll be sewing. I'll do a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here, and I did want to show you that because I pressed toward the light here, and then on my half square triangle, and then on my flying goose it's pressed in the opposite direction. So when I go to sew, it'll be really simple to match up those seam lines, and then I have one seam allowance going here and then the other going in the opposite direction. So that'll be nice and easy to sew together. Here's where I need to sew. I do not want to start sewing, however, on this end because I don't like to match up those seams right away. I like to do that at the end, so I'm simply going to flip the block over and match up my seams at the bottom, nestle them right together. Hopefully you can see. And pin. Scant 1/4 inch seam right down here. And I'll take a peek and see, and they matched up just right. I have those sewn. Now I'll repeat that same process off camera, right sides together. And if you notice I'm not pressing just yet, I'll wait until I finish sewing these as well. Now that I have my 3 rows sewn, I will go ahead and press, and I'll press the top row and the bottom row going toward the right and the center row going toward the left, so that my seams will nestle up when I sew them together. Here's my top and bottom rows. I've already pressed this one, and the seam allowance is going toward the right. So all I do is press to set the stitches and then go to the right. I brought over my center row, and I will set my stitches. Now, if you can see, this seam is going in one direction and that one is going in the opposite. And then attach the rows, right sides together. Again, pin indicating which direction I want to sew. And over at the machine, I'll carefully match up my seam lines. Scant 1/4 inch seam right down here. I've pinned my rows together. And this time I do have to start with matching up 2 seams in the beginning because they're both the same at each end, so I can't get around that. So I'll just do the best I can, but it does help to use a leader fabric. And my last match up, and that looks good. And open it up, and what you're looking for here is that these match up nicely and they look great, and that you're matching at the edge with your 1/4 inch seam allowance showing, and that looks good. And so off camera, I'll go ahead and do the same exact thing and attach my last row. And the final measure at 12.5 inches square. There you have it, the folded corners quilt block. If you pay attention to the little details and pick the right colors, you'll get a beautiful result. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.